Good morning.
Good morning.
It's good to see all of you here. Nice to be back here in Butler again. I enjoy the congregation here. So, my sermon this morning is bear one another's burdens. Up there on the overhead, that's my youngest brother and his little boy. And you can see one pack is a lot bigger than the other, right? There's Micah, he's my nephew. He can't carry everything he needs to carry, and so his dad has to carry extra. So he's bearing Micah's burden, and also Haley, my niece, she's with us too, so he's carrying for his other one. And let's see here. It's not changing.
Off on the side.
Maybe that's what the deal is here. That's right. Okay. There we go. I thought there was another one in between there. No. Okay. This is our 2013 trip. Or 2013. That's with everybody. So Keenan and Cyrus, they can carry what they need to, but we have the three little guys. We have to carry extra stuff, and I think Keenan and Cyrus really probably had to carry some extra. So we bear one another's burden. That's where no, that's not where we went. That's a little ahead. That's where we went the year before. But let's go back here let's go ahead and read Galatians chapter 6, 1 and 2. Galatians chapter 6. 1 and 2. He says, "Brethren, if anyone is caught in any trespass, you are spiritual, restore such a one in the spirit of gentleness, each one looking to yourself, so that you too will not be tempted. Bear one another's burdens, and thereby fulfill the law of Christ. For if anyone thinks he is something, when he is nothing, he deceives himself. But each one must examine his own work, and then he will have reason for boasting in regard to himself alone, and not regard to one another. For each one will bear his own load." So we need to bear one another's burdens. And usually, at some point in time, we're going to need some help ourselves. As he said, you are spiritual, restore such a one in the spirit of gentleness, each one looking to yourself, so that you too will not be tempted. So we're not above being tempted. We're not above having to have our burden carried once in a while. In 2012, two of my brothers, Baruch and Adam, and then Keenan and Cyrus and Seth, we went on a hiking trip. I can't remember. Yeah, Micah was with us that year, wasn't he? Yeah, he was there. I forgot he was there. But we went to the South Colony Lakes. This is one of the lakes. This is the one we camped closest to. And on the way up, Cyrus, he was sick. The day before, Keenan, he was sick. And then the day we were hiking in, Cyrus got sick, and he just didn't feel very good. And so I ended up carrying his pack part of the way up. So I had mine and his. And then by the next day, he was better and he was okay. But generally, Cyrus, he's pretty strong, and he doesn't have trouble carrying his own pack. And Seth, that was his second year. Is that your first year or second year? That was your first year? Maybe? Okay. So I didn't load him up very heavy, and he was way ahead of everybody. So I said next time he's getting some more stuff. But on the way down, he got more. I didn't know it at the time, but I was going to need some help at the end of our trip. The last morning we were there, September 1st, it was the opening day of grouse season, and a big male grouse walked into our camp while we were making breakfast. I think he wanted to be part of our breakfast. I said, "Cyrus, you want to shoot that grouse?" He said, "Yeah, I want to shoot him." So I handed him my .22 pistol, and he missed that one. So I said, I think there's some more back there. Let's see if we can find another one. So we found some more, and he missed again. Hitting the grouse with a 22 pistol is not the easiest thing. And so let me try. So I missed a few times, and I got one. So we had one, and I said, there's still one there. Shoot that one. So he shot, and he got that one. He hit it in the wing. So it could run just fine, but couldn't fly. So he started running down the mountain, so I took off chasing that grouse. I didn't know it, but there's a ledge a little ways down, and I think it was only about 5 feet or so. I don't know. Remember how high was that ledge? You remember? It was probably 5 feet. I couldn't stop. I was going too fast, and I was going downhill, so I just jumped. And when I landed, I didn't land very good, and I knew my leg hurt, but I didn't know how bad I hurt it. So I stood up, and my knee gave out, and I fell right back down again. And then I knew something was wrong. So I laid there for a little bit, and Cyrus came over, and I said, that grouse is right up there by the tree. So he picked it up, and I said, I'm just going to lay here for a few minutes. I'll be back here, and I'll be back to camp in a little bit. So the next time I got up, I was a lot more careful. I didn't put much weight on that leg. I could feel it squishing around in there and not too steady. And I could go uphill fine, but going downhill, my knee just wouldn't stay in place. And so I got back to camp. It's a little hill to walk back in there, and I had to turn sideways to get back into camp. And so I told him what happened. I said, well, Brooke said, well, I'll tell you what, I'll load up my pack and get out of here, and then I'll come back and get yours. So he said, you sit down. So I sat down for a couple minutes. I said, I'm not going to sit down. I could feel that leg getting stiff. I better keep moving. So I took my pack, and the stuff I carried up, I divided it up between my 3 boys and loaded them up. So my pack was pretty light, and I carried mine for about a mile, and then Brooke met us coming back. So we finished cleaning up camp while he was walking down. So I didn't know it right then on our way in that I was going to need some help having somebody else bear my burden. And I didn't complain about carrying Cyrus's pack, I don't think, did I? I don't know. But they didn't complain about carrying mine on the way down. They were happy to help me. They were pretty worried about me. And we made it down. But we might think we're strong and we can handle anything that comes along, but it only takes a few seconds to turn a strong man into a weak man. And we can fall just like anyone else can. And normally on our hiking trips, I'm usually carrying a lot of extra stuff for my boys, and sometimes maybe I have to carry their pack because they aren't feeling too good. Or several years ago, we took an older guy with us on a hiking trip. This before I had kids. I think I was 19. And going down into where we were going to stay was pretty easy. It was downhill all the way. And then coming back out, it was real steep going up, and he just couldn't do it. So I carried my pack up, went down and got his. But that's a lot more fun than having somebody else carry your burden because something's wrong with you. But sometimes we're going to need some help, no matter how strong we think we are or how great we think we are. So we need to bear one another's burdens, and then that way we can fulfill the law of Christ. We have to love one another. And Paul says here, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness. And earlier in this book, Paul did restore his brother. I'm not too sure he was real gentle about it. But if you go back to Galatians chapter 2 and verses 11 through 15, he says, but when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face, because he stood condemned. For prior to the coming of certain men from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But when they came, he began to withdraw and hold himself aloof, fearing the party of the circumcision. The rest of the Jews joined him in hypocrisy, with the result that even Barnabas was carried away by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that they were not straightforward about the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas in the presence of all, if you, being a Jew, live like the Gentiles and not like the Jews, how is it that you compel the Gentiles to live like the Jews? We are Jews by nature, and not sinners from among the Gentiles. So we need to restore our brother. And here Peter, he stood condemned, Paul says. He wouldn't associate with the Gentiles. He was afraid what the other Jews would say about him if he did. And the Jews and Gentiles had hated each other for thousands of years, and they still do hate one another. We see it in the news all the time. Israel hates her neighbors hate Israel, and they don't get along. But if they would become Christians and follow the law of Christ, love their neighbor as themselves, as Jesus taught them when he was on the earth, he taught about the Good Samaritan, and the attorney said, well, who's my neighbor? So he told him about the Samaritan. And he didn't like that story too well, but the Jews, they did not want to have anything to do with the Gentiles, and they still don't. And that's why Israel sends missiles over into the Gaza Strip, and the Gaza people in Gaza, they send their missiles over to Israel, and Israel has the Iron Dome to protect them, and then they invade the Gaza Strip, and they don't ever get along. But with Christianity, we're to love one another. In Galatians chapter 3, 27 and 28, he says, for all of you who are baptized into Christ have clothed yourself with Christ. There's neither Jew nor Greek, there's neither slave nor free, there's neither male nor female. For you are all one in Christ Jesus. And if you belong to Christ, then you're Abraham's descendants, heirs according to promise. So we're all sons of Abraham. We're baptized into Christ. He says there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free man, male nor female. In the church, we're not greater than one another. We're together. I can eat with a Mexican. I can eat with an African. A black man can marry a white man. A Mexican, he can marry a white person. We can have intermarriage, but what's the only requirement God gives for who to marry? Have to be only in the Lord, right? But sometimes people, they make a pretty big fuss about that. And cultures don't always like to mix, and sometimes it's a hard thing on that when that happens, but God doesn't give us any requirements about that. And if you, even in the Old Testament, if you look, in the Song of Solomon, what color was the bride there? Anybody know? Brown or maybe black, right? She says, some of the translations say black, or some of them say swarthy. Moses married a Cushite woman. What color is a Cushite woman? Dark. Depends on, they're Ethiopians. Some Ethiopians are pretty light and some are pretty dark. But they're all shade of darker brown than we are. But Peter, he was allowing those prejudiced things into his life. And Paul said he stood condemned. So, we might have different cultures. We might have different ideas about the way things ought to be. But as a Christian, we're to love one another. And we're to bear one another's burdens, even if we are from different cultures and have different ideas. Sometimes we may favor the rich over the poor. In James chapter 2, 1 through 5. James chapter 2, 1 through 5. He says, "My brethren, do not hold your faith in the glorious Lord Jesus Christ with an attitude of personal favoritism. For if a man comes into your assembly with a gold ring and dressed in fine clothes, and there also comes in a poor man in dirty clothes, and you pay special attention to one who is wearing fine clothes and say, 'You sit here in a good place,' and you say to the poor man, 'You stand over there,' or 'Sit down by my footstool,' have you not made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil motives? Listen, my brethren, did not God choose the poor of this world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom, which he promised to those who love him? But you have dishonored the poor man. Is it not the rich who oppress you and personally drag you into court? Do they not blaspheme the fair name by which you have been called?" Sometimes we favor the rich over the poor. We look at the way somebody's dressed and we treat them different than we would if somebody that is well dressed. Sometimes we can do something about our dress if we dress sloppy, and we can dress nicer than we should. But if somebody has raggedy clothes and there's not anything they can do about it, or not to show favoritism to them. I have a little story here. There's a man, he saw him in church on Wednesday evening. The man was in his 70s, his silver hair and a neat brown suit. And many times the man telling the story, Mike Riley wrote the story. I don't know who he is, but we'll say it's Mike. But many times Mike had seen him through the years, and a few months before he had asked him, he says, "Have you ever been to a church service in your life?" And the old man hesitated a little bit, and he said, "Well, yes, I have, about 60 years ago." And he told him the story. He was about 10 years old, and his parents didn't have much money. He was in a big family, and they had a hard time providing food, so there wasn't much left over for housing and clothes. And some of his neighbors invited him to go to church, and so he went along, and he heard the Bible stories in the class, and he sang those songs, and he was pretty excited about hearing those things. And after everything was over, the teacher called him over, and she said to him, she said, "Son, please don't come dressed again as you are now. We want you to look your best when you come to worship the Lord." And he stood there in his ragged overalls and his bare, dirty feet, and he said, "No, ma'am, I won't ever." And he never did. He never went back to church again. And that last day, when he was in his 70s, dressed in his nice suit, he was laying in his casket. That was the other time that he went to church. But we need to bear one another's burdens. And sometimes we think a lot different about people because of the way they might dress. Especially when we're in school, right? Some of you are homeschooled, and it doesn't really matter. You don't have a clue what the latest styles are. So you just wear whatever your mom and dad stick on you, right? And I don't pay much attention to what the latest styles are now either. So, but when you're in school, it matters a lot. A lot of times what kind of clothes you wear, and people think different. But we're not to think that way and favor the rich over the poor. Also, we're to wound our friend. He says, restore those. And if we're going to restore somebody, sometimes it may hurt. In Proverbs chapter 27, verse 6, he says, "Deceitful are the kisses of an enemy, but faithful are the wounds of a friend." So an enemy, he may try to make you think that you're just best buddies. And I said that backwards. It's faithful are the wounds of a friend, but deceitful are the kisses of an enemy. So who is an enemy that pretended to be a friend and gave his friend a kiss? Anybody know? Judas, right? He pretended he was Jesus' friend, but he was really an enemy. He deceived those people. Tried to deceive Jesus. He didn't deceive Jesus. Jesus knew what he was doing. But faithful are the wounds of a friend, Jesus, sometimes he said things that his disciples didn't want to hear, and it hurt them. He told Peter he's going to deny him 3 times. Peter said, I'll never do that. I'll die with you. But then he did. Jesus looked over at him, and Peter went out and wept. That hurt Peter, but it restored Peter also. And we have to say something. Ezekiel chapter 33, verses 1 through 9. Ezekiel chapter 33, 1 through 9. He says, And the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, speak to the sons of your people, and say to them, If I bring a sword upon the land, and the people of the land take one man from among them, and make him their watchman, and he sees the sword coming upon the land, and blows on the trumpet, and warns the people, then he who hears the sound of the trumpet, and does not take warning, and the sword comes and takes him away, his blood will be on his own head. He heard the sound of the trumpet, but he had not, I lost my place here. He said, he heard the sound of the trumpet, but he did not take warning. His blood will be upon himself. But had he taken warning, he would have delivered his life. But if the watchman sees the sword coming and does not blow the trumpet, and the people are not warned, and a sword comes and takes a person from them, he is taken away in his iniquity, but his blood I will require from the watchman's hand. Now as for you, son of man, I have appointed you as a watchman for the house of Israel. So you will hear a message from my mouth and give them a warning from me. When I say to the wicked, O wicked man, you will surely die, and you do not speak to warn the wicked from his way, that wicked man will die in his iniquity, but his blood I will require from your hand. But if you on your part warn a wicked man to turn from his way, and he does not turn from his way, he will die in his iniquity, but you have delivered your life. So we have a responsibility to warn those that we know are doing what is wrong. So if our friend is doing what's wrong and we say nothing, God says, I'm going to require his blood at your hand. That means you're responsible for what he's doing. But if you say you shouldn't do that, that's sin. And God will punish you for that. And he says, I don't care, I'm going to do it anyway. Then God says, his blood's on his own head. You've delivered yourself. But if you say nothing, you don't warn him, God said, you're responsible for him also. So try to restore him. In Matthew chapter 18, verse 15, he says, I skipped one. Sorry. I want to go to Galatians chapter 5, 19 through 21. Let's go there first. Galatians chapter 5, 19 through 21. He says, Now the deeds of the flesh are evident, which are immorality, impurity, sensuality, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, outbursts of anger, disputes, dissensions, factions, envying, drunkenness, carousing, and things like these, of which I forewarn you, just as I have forewarned you, that those who practice such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. Well, there's a lot of things in there. Immorality. And that's very common in our nation and in the world, immorality. People sleep together that aren't married, have sexual relations before they're not married. If your friends are talking about that, warn them. Tell them. That's sin. God will not let you into heaven for that. And you need to repent of it and quit. And also there's a lot of penalties you're going to pay in this life too. It's not easy being a single mother, or sometimes it ends up with a single father. But a lot of other things can happen there too. Impurity, sensuality, going to the dance, that's not to be a part of our Christian life. A lot of the schools, they like to have school dances, but we're not to go. And if your Christian friend wants to go, you're to warn them. Say, don't go. Idolatry, we're not to worship idols, not to worship money, be covetous person. He's the same as an idolater. Sorcery. We're not to have anything to do with witchcraft or magic. Harry Potter, he's not to be a part of our life, not to watch his movies either. Many things in there. Hatred and strife and jealousy. Drunkenness. We're to stay away from those things. Don't be a part of drunkenness. Don't let your friends be a part of drunkenness either. So if we see our friends in those things, warn them and don't participate in them. And we have a responsibility to warn them and not let them continue in their sin. Matthew chapter 18, 15 through 17. He says, if your brother sins, go and show him his fault in private. If he listens to you, you have won your brother. But if he does not listen to you, take one or two more with you, so that by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every fact may be confirmed. 1 Corinthians 15, 33. I'm sorry, I need to read verse 17 also. It says, if he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church, and if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. So we're to warn him and rebuke him about his sin. If he won't do anything, take somebody with you. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And then we're not to have anything to do with him. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 33. Do not be deceived. Bad company corrupts good morals. So if we think we can keep company with somebody that wants to stay in sin, we're deceiving ourselves. We're to part company with somebody that wants to continue in their sin. And number 2, sow to the Spirit. And don't grow weary of doing good. Go back to Galatians chapter 6, verses 9 and 10. He says, let us not lose heart in doing good, for in due time we will reap if we do not grow weary. So then, while we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially to those who are of the household of faith. So, don't grow weary in doing good. Be patient. Sometimes you have to wait in order to reap a harvest. Well, always you have to wait. When the farmer plants his crop in the spring, he's got to wait till fall, right? You can't plant it today and harvest tomorrow. You have to be patient. So, but if he says, this is silly, I've planted wheat yesterday and it's not up. He goes out there and goes through the field with his combine, and it's not going to do any good, right? He's just going to mess everything up. But don't grow weary. Break down barriers. And Barnabas, he was one that didn't grow weary of doing good. His name means son of encouragement. That's what Barnabas means. Acts chapter 9, verses 26 and 27. He says, when he came to Jerusalem, he was trying to associate with the disciples, but they were all afraid of him, not believing that he was a disciple. But Barnabas took hold of him and brought him to the apostles and described to them how he had seen the Lord on the road and that he had talked to him, and how at Damascus he had spoken out boldly in the name of Jesus. And he was talking and arguing with the Hellenistic Jews, but they were attempting to put him to death. But when the brethren learned of it, they brought him down to Caesarea and they sent him away to Tarsus. But Barnabas, he wanted to help Paul. Paul is a new Christian. And what would you think if you went to church and you walked in the door and everybody sees you and they walk the other way and they don't have anything to do with you? That'd be kind of discouraging. And Paul wasn't going to give up. He knew he was in the right place and he knew the Lord had spoken to him. So he wasn't going to quit. But for most people, that'd be the end of it. They'd say, well, fine, you don't want me here, I'll just leave. But Barnabas, he knew what Paul had been doing, and he knew he was a true Christian, and he wanted him to be accepted by the other people. And so he brought Paul in, introduced him to others. And you can't blame these people in some ways. Paul had probably put some of their friends and relatives in prison. He was probably responsible for the death of some of them. He was there when Stephen was stoned, and they probably had some hard feelings and didn't want to trust him. They probably thought that he's just trying to figure out who we are and where we meet, and then he's going to bring a bunch of soldiers in here and arrest us all. But Barnabas accepted him. And new Christians, they need encouragement and they need acceptance. And help them to bear their burden, not add to it by avoiding them, not wanting to have anything to do with them. Associate with people that others don't want to associate with. Mark chapter 2, 15 and 16. Mark chapter 2, 15 and 16. It says, he remained there until the death of Herod. I'm in Matthew. I want Mark. Sorry. Mark 2, 15 and 16. It happened that he was reclining at the table in his house, and many tax collectors and sinners were dining with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many of them, and they were following him. When the scribes of the Pharisees saw that he was eating with sinners and tax collectors, they said to his disciples, why is he eating and drinking with tax collectors and sinners? And hearing this, Jesus said to them, it is not those who are healthy who need a physician, but those who are sick. I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners. So Jesus associated with people that others didn't want to have anything to do with, and they thought it was terrible that he would be eating with them. And a lot of times we are worried about what other people are going to think when they see us with someone else. And maybe they're not the cleanest person. Maybe they're not a real good person. But we need to associate with them, try to win them for Christ. And Jesus was not drinking with them. He wasn't smoking marijuana with them. He wasn't sitting with them, but he was there with them. And sometimes we're going to have to be where the sinners are if we want to win them. And there's been a few times I wasn't too sure I wanted to be with that person. They wanted me to be with them. There's one guy there in town, and everybody knows him. And he's drunk a lot of the time, and he's been coming to church pretty regular the last month or so, but on Sunday morning. But several years ago, he wanted me to go out to breakfast with him. Oh man. Oh, sure, I'll go with you. But so we went out to breakfast, and I won't tell you the whole story, but he's quite the character. But I thought of this when Jesus was eating with those people. What in the world are people going to think if I'm out there with him? But at breakfast, he doesn't get drunk. He's usually later in the day, 5 o'clock or so. He's pretty out there. But anyways, sometimes that's not the easiest thing to do. But Jesus didn't join them in their sin. And this same guy, he told me, he said, Jesus drank beer. I said, how do you know that? He said, well, how do you hang out with sinners and not drink beer? I said, well, that's pretty easy. I said, I'm hanging out with you. I'm not drinking beer, am I? He said, well, no. But there's a little more to that story too, but that's not the point of my sermon. So You don't have to drink beer to hang out with sinners. So you can be with them. And Jesus didn't go along with their sin. He told them, go and sin no more. And Jesus told the man at the pool of Bethesda, you're made whole. Sin no more, lest the worst thing come on you. He told the woman caught in adultery, go and sin no more. And then number 3, don't think I'm something when I'm nothing. Galatians chapter 6 and verse 3. It says, for if anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. But each one must examine his own work, and then he will have reason for boasting in regard to himself alone and not in regard to another. For each one will bear his own load. So don't think I'm something when I'm nothing. And here's a picture of Amy Carmichael. I don't know if you guys ever read about this lady, but she's quite the lady. She's a missionary in India. And she really wanted to reach the Indian people. And she didn't like the way the normal missionaries worked over there. The missionaries there, they considered themselves to be way above the native Indian people in India. And when she was on her way to Kotagiri, there's a hillside retreat the missionaries like to go to. There are lots of hill stations, they called them, where the Europeans would move up into the higher mountain areas during the monsoon seasons in April and May, so they could get out of the hot weather and the heavy rains. And on the way up the mountain, she looked behind her and she saw what she didn't like about being a missionary in the normal way in India. And her 3 missionaries there, they were being carried up the mountain in sedan chairs by their servants. And then they had, I think, 36 servants all total for 4 people. Amy had 1, and she treated her servant more like a sister. Her servant had a few extra clothes of Amy's, and Amy was walking. She wasn't in the sedan chair. And she thought to herself, well, don't these servants need a break too? And she saw a few other things that wasn't exactly with her group, but some of the Europeans had the Indians carrying a piano up there. Another group had them carrying an iron bathtub up there for them, and they had all kinds of stuff that they were carrying for the missionaries. They had badminton rackets and nets and folding chairs and all kinds of things that they thought were necessary. But so she decided things had to change, and she wanted to live with just among the Indian people and speak their language and be with them every day, because she knew studying their language, she'd learn it, but she'd learn it a lot faster if she could just be with them every day, and she was forced to speak it. So she didn't get to do that because a lot of the missionary people, they just wouldn't go along with it, but she did stay with another missionary couple that worked real close with the Indian people, and they spoke the language fluently. So she ended up staying with them for a while, and then later she was able to do things the way she wanted, and she had a group of women that traveled through India, and they called themselves the Starry Cluster. And they would go into towns and villages and stay wherever they could and teach the women in the village. And she's a pretty amazing lady. One of the things she did, I don't know if you guys ever pay attention to Indian culture, but gold is very important to the Indians, the Indian culture. And they're one of the biggest. China passed them up now, but in recent history and most of the rest of history, they're the biggest importers of gold in the world. Because when you get married you get a lot of gold from your father-in-law, the bride does, and that's yours to keep. And Amy's group, at first they started out traveling during the day when it's really hot because there were robbers and they would take their things. But then Amy, she didn't wear jewelry, but some of the women with her did. And later, one of the husbands, he traveled with them. He cooked their food, and he told his wife, "You know what? We're not going to wear jewelry anymore." And she knew her father-in-law would be furious, and he was. So she took it off, and he said, "This isn't the way Christ would want us to be." So they took it off, and the other women, they decided the same thing. And then they could travel any time of the day they wanted, and so they started traveling at night when it was even more dangerous. And the robbers, they found out pretty soon they didn't have anything anyway, so they left them alone, and they could travel whenever they want. But she was quite the lady, and then she started an orphanage for children that nobody wanted over there. And she wanted to bear her own burden. She wasn't going to have somebody carrying her around all the time. And if we're going to reach other people, we're going to have to be on their level. And we can't expect them to haul us around and carry us around. We're to bear our own load, right? And if Jason Wicks has to carry me around all day long, how much is he going to accomplish at his job? Probably not much, right? Maybe he's a really strong guy, but I don't think he's that strong. But we need to bear our own load. We are to bear one another's burdens. But we can carry what we need to carry also. And the scribes and Pharisees, they like to tie up heavy loads. Matthew chapter 23, 1 through 4. Matthew chapter 23, 1 through 4. He says, "Then Jesus spoke to the crowds and to his disciples, saying, The scribes and Pharisees have seated themselves in the chair of Moses. Therefore, all that they tell you, do and observe. But do not do according to their deeds. For they say things and do not do them. They tie up heavy burdens and lay them on men's shoulders. But they themselves are unwilling to move them with so much as a finger." So we're not to tie up heavy loads on other people. We're to teach them what Christ said and not add to what he said. Don't make a lot of extra laws and rules for them to follow. Jesus taught his apostles to be servants. He didn't teach them to be masters. He taught them to bear their own burden. And he taught them to bear other people's burdens. Let's go to Galatians chapter 5 in verse 13. Galatians chapter 5 in verse 13. He says, "For you were called to freedom, brethren, only do not turn your freedom into an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another." In Galatians chapter 6 and verse 5, he says, "For each one will bear his own load." We're to serve one another, bear our own load. Don't disappear when there's work to be done. Help your parents. Parents have a lot of burden to bear, right? They feed you, they clothe you, make sure you're educated, probably paying some for your education. So help them out. And that's something any kid can do. If we have time to play Minecraft and, I don't know, other games where you try to blow up your opponent and whatever you do on those things, if you have extra time for that, you can have time to help your parents out with things they need help with and not complain about it. You can bear your own load. You can clean up after yourself, right? If you make a mess, what should you do? clean it up. You spill the milk, you sit there and, oh, I spilled my milk again. Mom's responsibility, not mine. And it's your responsibility to clean up the milk, right? And clean it up and do a good job. Don't feel sorry for yourself. Sometimes we like to feel sorry for ourselves and think we have life really hard. But there isn't anybody that everything is just the way it should be in their life and just real easy for them. Sometimes poor people think the rich people have everything just right, but there's a lot of things that a rich man has to worry about. The more you have, the more you have to figure out how to keep what you do have. And maybe the rich man thinks, well, his life's so simple, he didn't have to worry about anything. But both of them have trouble. And the Lord, He doesn't like us to feel sorry for ourselves. He doesn't like grumbling. He doesn't like whining and complaining. If you have a burden to bear and you can carry it, He expects you to carry it. And the Israelites, when they were in the wilderness, He destroyed them for grumbling. And if you think about some of the things they grumbled about, I think they had pretty good reason to grumble, but God didn't. When I get thirsty and I need a drink of water, I'm usually can have something within a few minutes, right? It's probably the same with the rest of you. The children of Israel, they were thirsty. They thought they were going to die out there in the wilderness, and there wasn't any place to get water. And they complained. God didn't kill them for that one, but He wasn't very happy with them. He provided water for them out of the rock. But if God wasn't pleased with their complaining when they needed water and they were going to die if they didn't get it, we don't have any reason to complain. Sometimes they didn't have food to eat. Then the Lord provided manna for them. And then they had to eat manna 365 days a year, 3 times a day. A lot of times we get tired of eating the same thing for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. We want to have variety, but you talk to a few old people, I don't know if there's any. Mr. Crockett, you the oldest one here? No, who's the oldest one here? Where's Bill? Bill Herndon. Yeah, that's right. He's the oldest one here. When you were a kid, did you eat cornmeal mush very often?
Did I eat very often?
Cornmeal mush.
Yeah.
How many times a day do you eat mush?
That's been a long time ago.
A long time ago. I don't know. But I know some of those old people, they eat cornmeal mush for breakfast, and then they eat fried mush for lunch and fried mush for supper, and that's what they ate. People in Mexico, they eat a lot of the same things over and over. I don't know, some of you might know Javier. He lives in Longmont. He said, people in the United States, he said, they have a lot of trouble. He said, in Mexico, we don't have to worry about what we're going to eat for breakfast. We don't have to worry about what we're going to eat for lunch or supper. He said, we eat beans and tortillas for breakfast, we eat beans and tortillas for lunch, and we eat beans and tortillas for supper. Here you got to figure out what you're going to have for breakfast. Then you got to figure out what you're going to have for lunch. But you what?
Just concerned that we had something to eat.
When you were a kid? Yeah. So if we have legitimate needs and concerns, God wants to hear about them. But if it's just complaining and we don't like what's on our plate, God doesn't want to hear any complaining. He's not going to be happy with us. And He struck those people dead in the wilderness. And God doesn't have a complaint box. If you have some complaints, He doesn't care. Even if you have to eat beans and tortillas 3 times a day, 365 days a year. If you have something on your plate, we're to be thankful and be happy. And if we have cares and anxieties, we need to cast them on Him. In 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 7, he says, casting all your anxiety on Him because He cares for you. So, don't worry, but cast our cares and anxieties on Him, because He does care for us. And we can bear one another's burdens. love one another, not think of one another, of ourselves as more important than other people, but bear their burden, bear our own burden, and that way we can fulfill the law of Christ if we love our neighbor as ourselves. And I'll turn it over to Sam Yoder.